If you're able, let's stand and sing together Where Your Treasure Is while we release the children to Children's Church. And then Tim will give us the lesson. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be if you follow Jesus every day. He will lead you as you walk along the way. He'll take care of all your troubles. He will see you through and through if you follow the King of Kings. He will give whatever you ask as you walk along the path. Follow the King of Kings. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be if you follow Jesus every day. He will lead you as you walk along the way. He'll take care of all your troubles. He will see you through and through if you follow the King of Kings. He will give whatever you ask as you walk along the path. Follow the King of Kings. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be if you follow Jesus every day. He will lead you as you walk along the way. Amen. Please be seated.
You almost heard some tearing of paper a minute ago because I thought pretty much Simon Peter had pretty much covered everything I was going to cover today. So I'll just say thank you for the segue into what I want to share today with my thoughts. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for being here today and for worshiping with us together. We worship together every Sunday, so I would encourage you to come back and be with us again. So as we begin today, I just want to ask a question. I want to pose this to you and just let you think about it over the course of the next 3 or 4 hours that we're together, and just see what your conclusion is. And the question really is this: are you rich? Are you rich? And perhaps by the time that we're finished, maybe your answer will have changed a little bit. You see, as we kind of move through into the final instructions that James is giving in the book of James, and we've been covering lessons from that book for some time now because they're very practical to Christians even today. And James presented those lessons in his letter back then because he cared so much about those Jewish Christians that had been scattered really throughout Palestine. He wanted to make sure that they got and they understood some important teachings that he wanted to impress upon them. And so we've been covering those because 2,000 years later, those same teachings are very applicable. So as we kind of continue into this latter part of James's thoughts, we're going to talk about a little bit today about the rich, because that's what James has already talked about and then talks about it even more. You see, when James first started his book, he talked about things like patience in his letter. He talked about the tongue and how we should control our tongue. He talked about the rich. He talked about the treatment of others and how we should do that. He talked about sin and prayer, and he talked about forgiveness. And he did that really in much of the first chapter. And then in the 5th chapter, which is where we're starting today, he kind of talks about it again and kind of summarizes what he started in the first chapter. And then in chapters 2 through 4, he kind of goes into even more detail about those subjects that he thinks are very important. And so as we get to chapter 5, which is where we're going to look at today, in chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, we're looking at James discussing the rich. And he's not condemning the rich. He's condemning the rich who unjustly handle the wealth that they've been given. And so today, in a follow-up, and I don't know why my voice is going somewhere. If you find it, send it back. Excuse me. But I mentioned the question, are you rich? And so today, as a follow-up to that, we're really going to look at this in our thoughts. Two more questions. Rich man or poor man? Poor man. And I hope that during the time that we're together, that maybe your thoughts will change on that subject. So, from a biblical perspective, wealth was something even common in James's day. And so it was something that was commonplace. There were wealthy people then, but there were also very poor people. I mean, the Bible doesn't condemn wealth, but it does condemn how you handle the wealth that you've been given. It condemns whether or not you've included God in the wealth that you've attained. It condemns the heart when the heart focuses on self and not on others. And so James really addresses that today. And so let's take a look as we begin. If you have your Bibles, we're going to look at the first 6 verses of James chapter 5. You can follow along. I'll be reading from the NIV. It says this. It says, "Now listen, you rich people." So, he is addressing this solidly at a certain group. "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You've hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you." So James writes this to those Jewish Christians. And James didn't consider wealth to be, or riches to be, a sin either. But he was concerned about how people were handling the wealth that they'd been given. And he was also concerned about the treatment that many of the wealthy were dealing out to those who were their workers. They were treating them unfairly. And so James is addressing that as well. And so in this passage that I just read, James levies 3 charges against the unjust rich. And we're going to look at those in just a minute. But before we do that, I'm wondering, and I'm still wondering, James is writing to these Jewish Christians who've been scattered. So is he addressing those first century Christians who received his letter, who may have wealth and who maybe aren't really doing what God would have them to do? Or was he addressing some non-Christians who may have come into the assemblies of the church, who also may have been wealthy, and perhaps they weren't dealing in such a way where God was being honored by their gift, by what their wealth was, and also at the same time they were ignoring those who were in need? Or perhaps he was just talking in general about the wealthy who were treating people unfairly, and many of those people could have been in that assembly of those Jewish Christians, and they had been the ones who really were treated unjustly, who weren't paid for their labor. And maybe he was trying to encourage them not to be disappointed, because there's greater things in store for them. I can't answer that for sure, but I know that regardless of who James was really trying to address, it doesn't change the fact of the attitude of those who were rich, especially those who were rich and not handling their wealth in the way that would be pleasing to God. He also went on to say that if that's you, if you have wealth and you're treating people unjustly and you're forgetting God, then God will punish you. Now, before we kind of start pointing fingers at the rich, and if you're sitting there going, well, that ain't me, so I can sit back and I don't even have to listen to Tim today because it has nothing to do with me. Before you do that, I will tell you without a doubt that every one of us here is rich in many ways. But I would say without a doubt that at least someone yesterday who came through the pantry would consider all of us rich. I would say without a doubt that there are hundreds of people in this community who would look at us regardless of our overall income and consider us rich because they have little to nothing. I would say even in our country there are thousands upon thousands who would look at each one of us and say, wow, they are rich because they have nothing. And then I would also say there are millions in our world who would look at each one of us today and say, I would love to take their place because they are rich, because those people have nothing. So before we get comfortable, let's squirm a little bit and let's make sure that we listen to what James really has to say. So the first charge that James is going to levy against these unjust rich is this. He's basically saying, rich man, you are charged with the following: insensitivity. And so in verses 2 and 3 of the passage I just read from James, we're going to touch on that. You see, the rich were insensitive to the right priorities that they should have in their lives, and also to the needs of others. And so James is calling them out. And again, they may very well have been in the assembly that he was writing the letter to. In James's day, wealth consisted really of three things. It consisted of food, clothing, and money. And you see, the wealthy ate very well, and they dressed very lavishly, and they spent their money on whatever they wanted to. And James is really saying that your wealth, in that passage, probably meaning food, has rotted, and that the moths have eaten your clothes, those fancy clothes that you've bought, and that your gold and your silver are corroded. Now, we know that gold and silver can't rust, but James is using a figure of speech here because basically he's saying that your gold and silver have lost their value because spiritually they have no value the way you're using your wealth. You see, they'd accumulated food and fashion and fortune, and yet they were worthless, all those things, because they valued them more highly than God. They valued them more highly than anyone around them who they came in contact with. So James is calling them out. They spiritually disregarded the fact that every blessing comes from God because God played no part in how they had their wealth or what they did with their wealth. And so, you see, those who abuse that wealth are going to eventually have a change in their fortune because they're going to lose all that they had, all that they banked on, all that they counted on to make them feel fulfilled. And James is saying, you're missing the boat here. In fact, he speaks of their wealth as already rotted. He speaks of their clothing as already been moth-eaten. He speaks of their money as already being devalued, even though they're sitting there and maybe, they're looking pretty good. James says because of the fact that you've left God out, all of those things that you put such a high value on, they are worthless when it comes to God. We can fill our tables with food and even more than we need, and yet there are those who struggle for their daily bread. We can fill our closets until we can't remember what's in them. In fact, we can be like the man that says, I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger just to have more closet space, to put our clothes and our shoes and all the things that we bought. We can do that as well. And while others are struggling to just simply find food to feed their families, we are eating lavishly, even though they're barely able to survive. James hated the insensitivity that was coming across and part of some of the unjust rich of his day. Some of them maybe had been Christians themselves or have been Christians themselves. And he's trying to explain to them that what the world counts as wealth is worthless when it comes to God. So he levies this charge of insensitivity, of not giving credit to where those blessings come from, and definitely not thinking about those who are in dire straits when it comes to the things that they don't have and just trying to make ends meet. Then he goes on, the second charge, in addition to sensitivity, he says, Rich man, you are charged with the following. You are charged with injustice. And he mentions that in the first part of verse 4 as well as in verse 6 of that chapter 5 that we read. You see, the rich, James speaks about, they were guilty of great injustice. They had defrauded their workers. They had cheated them out of their wages. And they also had gained wealth at the expense of others. So they were guilty of injustice. You see, the people in James's day, they worked for a day's wage. They went out into the fields and worked, and at the end of the day, they expected to be paid, and with the money they were paid, they went and bought food to feed their families, either for that evening or for the next day. And James is saying these unjust rich aren't even paying their workers. They're keeping that money for themselves to add to their already wealth that they have. Well, God had established long before laws to protect those against unjust employers. In fact, if we take a look in Deuteronomy 24 verses 14 and 15 says this. It says, "Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns. Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and are counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin." Deuteronomy 24. And then he goes on also to say something similar in Leviticus when he says, "Do not defraud your neighbor or rob him. Do not hold back the wages of a hired man overnight." James is saying to these unjust rich, you, sir, you, this group, you are suffering the sin of injustice because you're not treating people fairly who you've hired to do a job. If you look in James chapter 5, in verse 4, in fact, he indicates that when the work is done and the harvest is gathered, well, the rich get even more wealthy. And yet all those who did the work, they get nothing because they're not being paid. And then even beyond that, he talks about and implies that there's even more injustice in verse 6 because these wealthy can buy off judges and they can change verdicts because of the wealth they have. And they can influence people. And they can continue to do things that may be wrong, but yet get by because of their wealth. And he's saying that the cries of those that they've defrauded have reached the ears of the Almighty Judge. And the Almighty Judge can't be bought. He cannot be bought. And he will be heard from. And so he's warning those who may think that they are wealthy, but yet in reality are worth nothing when it comes to the sight of God. And so, in addition to being insensitive and unjust, he goes on and he's going to talk about the third one. But before he does that, he underscores or introduces us to a thought that God hates injustice, but God is very familiar with injustice. In fact, you think about Jesus and you think about the poor. God sent his son to dwell among those who had been overlooked, those people who'd been insignificant in Jesus' day. And yet, what happened? Jesus was born to a poor virgin in a borrowed stable, and he was buried in a borrowed tomb. He's used to being around people that have little, and he's afraid that when they're forgotten and ignored, that's something that we can't tolerate and that God can't tolerate either. There's a story that's told by an unknown minister, an unknown writer rather, who described Jesus' ministry this way. And this is how we know that Jesus knows what injustice is all about. He wrote this, he said, "The preacher never stopped talking about money. The congregation clutched their billfolds and they squirmed. He told them not to worry about stuff that will rot. He told them that the folding stuff was not the currency to buy meaning and happiness. He singled out one man and told him to sell everything and then give the proceeds to the poor. He had them shaking their heads when he said, "Happy are the poor." Some of the best dressed stomped out, their noses in the air. A few of the wealthy and powerful slipped quietly into a back room and had a contract put out on the young preacher's life. And it only cost them 30 pieces of silver. You see, Jesus knows injustice. And God is going to punish those who provide injustice or injustice to people. The third charge that he brings, in addition to insensitivity and injustice, he says basically, "Rich man, you are charged with the following: indulgence." He talks about that, James does, in verse 5. Basically, these rich were surrounded by needy. They hired people who had nothing in the hopes that they had of making some money to take care of their family. And yet, what the rich did was continued to satisfy themselves and ignore those who were in need. And even beyond riches, there's a lesson here. There's a lesson beyond just people who have money and who choose not to use it to glorify God and to help others. And that's this: when God is not at the center of our lives, someone or something will be, and there will be no room for God. James is basically saying in this passage that these people who were unjustly treating others, their wealth had replaced God in their lives. They'd allowed that to happen. We can't allow anything today to replace God in our lives, regardless of what it is. We can't justify that, because God needs to be the center of our lives. You see, those that James addressed, they fed themselves really on the riches that they had while they spiritually starved to death. They were spiritually starving to death because they focused on the wrong things. They were like pigs that ate themselves into the slaughterhouse. Judgment, as we talked about a week or so ago with the man who built his barns, tore down the others and built more, judgment can happen at any time. And James is trying to emphasize that even to those that he's talking to. If we become wealthy at the expense of the hopeless, and if our wealth we hoard it at the expense of the homeless, God is going to punish those people that do that. And so James is really issuing a strict warning to those who are not using what they've been blessed with to bring glory to God and to help those who are needy, help those who are in need. When we first started the passage that I read, he talked about weeping and wailing. And if you're not careful, you could look at that and say, well, they're sad because they lost all their wealth. No. The weeping and the wailing that James talked about is the fact that they lost their souls because they didn't focus on the things they should have focused on. They didn't include God in what they had. They chose to ignore God. And by abandoning God in exchange for self-indulgence and personal gain, the vault that we know as eternity for those people is going to be empty. There's nothing in there for them. Their wealth will be gone. The only thing they'll find is pain and suffering and hopelessness. Even more hopelessness than they issued on the poor when they ignored them or they defrauded their pay. God never judges us by a bank account. He never judges us by a statement of worth. Instead, he searches our heart for the true riches that are there. He looks for the righteous, and he looks for what's lacking and what is there in our hearts. When we talk about riches, riches are morally neutral. They're not good or bad. It's how we choose to use them and whether we include God in what we've been given. You know, earlier I asked you, are you rich? Are you rich? I think it depends on who defines rich and what we consider as rich. You know, in a global sense, as I mentioned earlier, we're all rich compared to many in this world. In a worldly sense, we may be rich because we have money in our bank account, but we could be worthless, so to speak, when it comes to how God views what we've been given. Or, in a godly sense, we may be rich because of the wealth that's contained in our hearts, because of what's evident by our attitudes and our actions toward God and toward others. And it has nothing to do with our bank account, really. It has to do with our hearts. And if we distribute generously to those in need, and we give glory to God for what we have, then we are rich. We're also rich because Jesus came to be our example of service, of love, and of forgiveness. He died, he was buried, he rose again so that we could experience just a ton of blessings every day. And we get those blessings through God's grace and his mercy. We get those blessings because of the salvation found only in Jesus Christ. And we get those blessings through an inheritance that's so valuable, it doesn't lose its value even throughout all eternity. As a result, we have the opportunity to be so very rich, and we owe it all to Jesus Christ. So, are you a rich man or are you a poor man? If God is at the center of our lives, we should all consider ourselves extremely rich because we have his blessings. If God is not at the center of our life, then when it comes to how God views us, we are poor because we're missing out on all the blessings that he has to offer through Jesus. Rich man or poor man, we each need to decide for ourselves who we are as well as what's important in our lives. Ken?